Well, good morning, and welcome to the PSA's first ever virtual annual meeting. I hope you've already had a chance to explore the conference venue and like what you see. We've had an exciting 3 days of symposia and poster sessions coming up. In addition, all of the abstract presentations are pre-recorded and available for viewing at your convenience. With that, it's time to start the annual meeting with the WPSA lecture. For that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sammy Dridi, University of Arkansas. Sammy is this year's president of WPSA USA. Sammy?
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntyre, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and I hope wherever you are that you are all safe and healthy. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to thank PSA for organizing this virtual meeting, and also I would like to thank the Informa Market for the high-tech. I would like to thank the WPSA USA branch, Robert Van Wy, Tony Piscator, Pitex Sitar, Darren Karcher, Todd Applegate, and Bob Burash. I would like also to thank my colleague from WPSA Canada branch with their president, Dr. Bruce Rath-Gibber and his team, and also my colleague, Dr. Gerardo Nava, the president of WPSA Mexico branch. I am really delighted and extremely pleased to welcoming Dr. Frank McLerner, and I would like to thank him for accepting our invitation. He is currently professor and cooperative extension specialist and director of Clarity and Leadership for Environmental Awareness in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. He is also adjunct professor at the College of Animal Science at Northwest Agriculture and Forestry University at Yangling, China. Dr. McLerner's research focuses mainly on air quality and air emission from livestock operation and their association with farm, worker, and communities' health. He has more than 110 publications in highly ranked journal and leading environmental and animal science journal. He is nationally and internationally recognized as expert in air quality and livestock interaction. He has been honored by several national and international organizations. He delivered many invited high-quality lectures, both abroad and in the US. And if you check his website, Frank is well-funded. He secured more than $12 million extramural funding. Before I close the introduction, please hold your question, and you have a team chat on the right corner of your screen. If you have any question, maybe you can post those questions there. And after Frank's presentation, then we will address those questions. Without further ado, now I would like to turn the mic to Frank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dridi, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and well, I'm actually in my office, but I'm pretty sure that we will still have a good time virtually together. I was asked to talk to you about the 2050 challenge, feeding the world without wasting it. The 2050 challenge is the challenge of feeding a pretty drastically growing human population on our planet, and we have, of course, resource issues, and they will be discussed in today's lecture. Before I go any further into the actual subject matter area, I encourage you to be on Twitter, and once you are there, follow me. GHG Guru is my handle. There's a lot going on this Twitter site, I can promise you. I also have a blog in my CLEAR Center. I'm the director of the CLEAR Center, and this blog is quite active. Oftentimes discuss newspaper articles or reports and so forth. Just like the last week's Burger King commercial on cow emissions. You might have seen that, and if not, then you should see it, because it really shows you how important it is that in agriculture we really develop a voice and understanding of what the true impacts are of livestock and poultry. There's a lot of confusion out there, and there are some players that don't mean very well. So I first just start with some facts and fiction around livestock, poultry, and climate. And indeed, I will talk a lot about climate today. So you hear things such as that. Livestock and poultry produce 18% of our greenhouse gases. Livestock and poultry produce more greenhouse gases. When I say GHG, it's always greenhouse gases. Livestock and poultry produce more greenhouse gases than all global transportation. Meaning, what that says is that livestock and poultry produce more greenhouse gases, leading to climate change, than all cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships in the world combined. Then it says, oftentimes in the reporting, that 70%, 70 of all agricultural land is used for livestock and poultry. I can tell you neither of these 3 points is factual. Some of them are rooted in a publication that is now almost ancient from 2006. It was titled Livestock's Long Shadow. And in its executive summary, it said that the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. And it went on as saying this is a higher share than transportation. Now, just so you know, I, at the time, a few years after this came out, rebutted the report in this central statement here, because they used different ways of quantifying the impact livestock and poultry has on climate versus the impact transportation has. For livestock and poultry, they used what's called a life cycle assessment, which is a comprehensive assessment of a service or product, such as a pound of meat or a gallon of milk or something like that, or an egg. So they used a life cycle assessment approach for livestock and poultry, but they used only direct emission measurements for transportation, not the life cycle approach for transportation. So while they looked at anything from soil to plants, animal emissions, to getting the product from the farm to the processors and then eventually to the consumers, while they did that for livestock and poultry, on the transportation side, they only looked at tailpipe emissions. So I critiqued that, and the authors actually acknowledged my criticism. You saw at the time maybe reports such as this one here. This in particular was an interesting one because one of the authors of Livestock's Long Shadow was interviewed and asked about my criticism. And he then said, and I quote, oops, doesn't work for some reason. He said that Midlerner has a point. There you go. I must say honestly that he, that's me, Frank Midlerner, has a point. We factored in everything for meat emissions, and we didn't do the same thing for transportation. So they acknowledged that, and I give them a lot of credit for it. And I have worked with the FAO since, sometimes in some leadership positions. But many of the people who have a beef with, so to say, with animal agriculture liked this so much, this comparison of livestock and poultry on the one side with transportation on the other, that they continue using it. And that has caused a lot of international trouble. Okay, so while it's more the cattle industries, beef and dairy, that are under the gun for greenhouse gases, the poultry industry also gets its fair share. And I will talk to you a little bit about what greenhouse gases are, what they do, how they differ from one another, and so forth, because I think that this is knowledge that is important for you to have. So, first of all, what is greenhouse? What is the whole issue around climate change and greenhouse gases and so on? So a few slides on that. So all throughout the world, we see changes happening to our climate. Here you see the North Pole, and you see the ice cap of the North Pole 20 years ago almost 40 years ago now in red. And then in white, you see what it was very recently. We have a clear shrinking of the ice caps. We have changes in climate in various regions, whether that's the tundra in Siberia, whether that's other areas throughout Africa, Asia. We see marked changes in regional climate. And overall, it makes us pause and say, well, what is going on? And most climate scientists will tell you, we do indeed have a change in climate, and they will continue by saying that a major cause for that change in climate is human impacts. So what do greenhouse gases do to our climate? So this slide here shows the sun radiating solar beams to the surface of the Earth, and normally these solar beams and therefore radiant heat from the sun would be reflected back into space. If there weren't these so-called greenhouse gases, gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, they pretty much form a blanket over our atmosphere. Imagine just a blanket that you put over your body to stay warm. What does a blanket do? It retains your body temperature close to your body. And that's what greenhouse gases do. They form this blanket over our Earth's atmosphere. So that in itself is not a bad thing. In fact, without greenhouse gases, we could not live on this planet. It would be way too cold. The problem is that we put so much of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that the blanket is getting too thick, and therefore the heat from the sun is retained in our atmosphere, and it gets warmer and warmer and warmer. And so the question then is, how much CO2, how much methane, how much nitrous oxide and other gases are produced, by whom, and how can we reduce those gases so that they come back to a level that we can manage better? So when you see greenhouse gases discussed, then you most likely will see these numbers. They compare CO2, carbon dioxide, with methane and nitrous oxide based on what's called the global warming potential, abbreviated GWP 100. That's the potential of these gases over a period of 100 years to warm our planet. CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide are depicted as being different, with methane being almost 30 times more heat trapping than CO2, and nitrous oxide almost more heat trapping, 265 more heat trapping than CO2. So that is where the focus comes from on livestock and poultry, that these animals produce both methane and nitrous oxide, but generally the focus is on methane. Because most people who are anti-livestock and poultry are really focusing in on cattle. And here in particular, beef and dairy. So while it's true that methane is 28 times more potent and nitrous oxide 265 times more potent than CO2, this is only part of the story, and I will tell you the rest of the story, and it's very important to pay attention on the next few slides. This slide here from the National Academy of Sciences shows the global methane budget. What you see on the left side here are different sources emitting methane, such as fossil fuel production and use to the left, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, wetlands, other agricultural emissions. And these different sources emit a total of 558, let's call it 560 teragrams of methane per year globally. 560 teragrams of methane per year are emitted. So, and these are the different sources that I just mentioned. However, what those people who use methane to critique livestock and poultry, what they leave out is that methane is not just produced. But on the right side, you see that just like with any proper budget, you don't just have one side, but you also have a second side. In the case of your budget, it might be income and expenses. In the case of methane, you have emissions on the left side from different sources. And on the right side, you have sinks. Look at that. Total sinks amounting to 548 teragrams. Meaning, on the left side, 560 teragrams are put into the atmosphere, but 550 teragrams are destroyed or going back into soils. In other words, the net in our atmosphere is not 560, the net in our atmosphere is 10. And if that doesn't make you pause and wonder, have you ever heard this before? Have you ever heard this kind of nuanced discussion? Most people have not. They only hear that agriculture, let's say, produces a lot of methane, and that's the end of the story. But this nuanced discussion is very important. So remember, as a take-home, methane is not just produced, methane is also destroyed. This large arrow here that you see shows that there is a major reaction, a chemical reaction in the atmosphere. This chemical reaction is referred to as hydroxyl oxidation. Hydroxyl oxidation, or in short, oxidation, occurs when radicals in the air get in contact with methane, which is CH4, and these radicals steal hydrogen from the CH4, from the methane. And when they do, they convert methane into CO2. And that happens within a short time period. So remember, methane is not just produced, it's also destroyed, almost at equal rates. Very important to know. What else is different between CO2 and, on the one side, methane and nitrous oxide on the other side? Well, CO2 and nitrous oxide are referred to as long-lived climate pollutants. Once they're in the air, they stay there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Methane is different. Methane has a lifespan of only 10 years. And as I just showed you on the previous slide, it's not just produced, it's also destroyed, almost at equal rates. So how does that matter? Why do we care how long these gases are in the air? We care because the long-lived climate pollutants, CO2 and nitrous oxide, are largely produced, and then once they are in the air, they stay there forever, pretty much. Whereas methane is produced and then also destroyed in a short sequence. And why that matters, I will show you in a minute. I will show you now a couple of slides, and you will wonder, why does he show us all these images showing cows? This is a poultry meeting. I show you those images around cows because that's where the majority of the criticism is, but it applies just as well to poultry, just to a lesser extent. I will show you how gases from livestock and poultry, which we call biogenic methane, for example, how they differ from other greenhouse gases that are more of fossil fuel nature. And before I go any further, just so you are clear, if you ask 1,000 climate scientists what the main contributor of human activity is to a changing climate, of the 1,000 scientists, the vast majority, 995, will tell you the number one contributor of human-caused climate impacts are caused by the use of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels being oil, coal, and gas that were stored in the ground for a long time. We have extracted those, and every time we do extract them, we burn them, and we put new additional carbon in the atmosphere. And this is really important to emphasize. The carbon that we produce and put into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuel is new and additional. Because it was in the ground for so long, we're extracting it, we are putting it into the atmosphere. So let's see how that's different from livestock. Again, I have a cow depicted here just to make sure that people understand the so-called biogenic carbon cycle. So methane is CH4. Methane is CH4. Have you ever wondered where the carbon, the C, from the methane comes from and where it goes to? I will lead you through it. The whole story starts with what we learned in the school as being photosynthesis. What do plants need to grow? Well, plants need sunlight, they need water, and they need carbon, CO2 actually. And that's depicted here. So plants need CO2, and the carbon in the CO2 is the carbon they need, the plants need, to grow carbohydrates, such as cellulose or starch. And whether you are a cow or a chicken, every animal that we feed requires plant material to grow, to consume. And that plant material, while it was alive, assimilated carbon from the atmosphere, CO2. That's how it all starts. That CO2 then becomes carbohydrates, as again cellulose or maybe starch. And then in the case of a cow, some of that carbon becomes methane gas that's belched out. Some of the other methane will come from cattle's manure. And the same, of course, is also true for poultry. I don't need to tell you that poultries don't ruminate, but poultry does, of course, have manure that produces methane. That methane, CH4, is then in the atmosphere for 10 years, And during the so-called hydroxyl oxidation process, that methane is then converted back into CO2. So what I'm telling you is this. The carbon that's in the methane, that either comes from chickens or from cows, that carbon in the methane is not new and additional. That carbon is recycled carbon. It was in the atmosphere before in form of CO2, and it will become CO2 again after being oxidized. In other words, the carbon from livestock production, from the methane that's in livestock production, livestock or poultry production, is recycled carbon and not new and additional carbon. In other words, if you keep livestock and poultry herds and or flocks at even rates, if you don't increase the numbers, then you're not increasing or you're not adding additional new methane. If you're not adding additional new methane, then you're not adding additional new warming. And this is critically important for you to know. If you're not adding additional livestock and poultry herds and flocks, then you're not adding additional new methane. And if you don't add additional methane, then you're not adding additional warming. I'm trying to get that narrative out in the mainstream media and to all of those people who don't wish us so well, because it is extremely important that we get this narrative out, okay? It's extremely important. I will now show you how this biogenic carbon cycle, and therefore biogenic methane, differs from fossil methane. So remember, biogenic methane is a cycle. The carbon comes from the atmosphere, goes into plants, is then belched out or produced from manure, and that methane then becomes CO2 again, okay? That's the biogenic carbon cycle. So the next one here, the next slide shows how fossil fuel carbon is different. So here you have material that was once plant material or dinosaurs or so, and these animals and plants died a long time ago. They decayed, they are fossilized, and these fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, are stored in the ground. We are extracting them, either on land or in the oceans. We are extracting them from the ground. And what do we do with them? We burn them. And every time we do so, we add new and additional carbon to the atmosphere. So in other words, fossil carbon, which is responsible for 80% of our greenhouse gases in a country like the United States, 80% of our greenhouse gases, this fossil carbon is new and additional. Every time you drive your car, you put new additional carbon into the atmosphere. But if you have a poultry operation or a cattle operation with a set number of animals that hasn't changed, meaning hasn't gone up in a long time, then these animals have not added new additional carbon to the atmosphere. Now, nitrous oxide is a little bit of a different story, but I'm talking about methane right now. So remember, biogenic carbon versus fossil carbon are very different. And now I will give you a little more of that lecture, because that's really important. So how does a gas like CO2 differ from a gas like methane? And here's a depiction of that. So if you were to drive your car on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, and so on, then here's what happens. On Monday, you drive and you put CO2 into the air. On Tuesday, you drive again to work, same distance, let's say, and you add new additional CO2 to the atmosphere that is now in addition to what you put out on Monday. On Wednesday, you drive again and you put out an additional amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, which is now in addition to what you put in on Tuesday and on Monday. In other words, every time you burn fossil fuel, you add additional new CO2 to the existing stock of gas that's already there. That's why CO2 and also nitrous oxide are called stock gases. But it's different for methane. Here, the amount of methane that is being put out is equal to the amount of methane that's being destroyed through hydroxyl oxidation. That is why this is called a flow gas. It's not a stock gas, it's a flow gas. So if you have a given number of animals and they put out methane on Monday, and then again on Tuesday, what they put out on Tuesday is not in addition to what they put out on Monday, because the production and destruction are balanced out. So take-home message here, long-lived climate pollutants like CO2 and nitrous oxide are stock gases. Every time you produce them, you add to the existing stock. Whereas methane is a flow gas where you don't accumulate, but you actually have a constant flow of that gas. The only way that this would go up is if we increase number of animals pretty drastically. So then we would have a pulse, a one-time pulse of additional emissions. If you want to know more about this, I encourage you to read those papers here. The first two are pretty non-technical. They came from Oxford University. Michelle Kane is one of them. Another one is Miles Allen. Miles Allen is a professor at Oxford University, also member of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. He is driving this narrative very hard now, and he is getting someplace. The concept that they are promoting is the so-called GWP star. You might remember I told you about the GWP 100, right? Of just saying methane is 28 times more potent than CO2 and nitrous oxide is 265 times more potent. Well, these people from Oxford say this is not accurate for methane if you are interested in describing the warming of this gas. Let me explain. So there are three scenarios here: warming, stable, and cooling scenario of our atmosphere, okay? So imagine we were to either increase methane by 35% over 30 years, or we were to decrease methane by 10%, or decrease methane by 35%. What would the impact of increasing, slightly decreasing, or strongly decreasing of methane be over 30 years? What would that impact be on, first, the so-called CO2 equivalent numbers? And that's depicted here. The CO2 equivalent numbers are the numbers that convert methane into CO2, and that's that 28 number that I gave you before. So if you look at the conventional way of characterizing greenhouse gases, then the rising of methane, the fall of methane slightly or strongly would all increase CO2 equivalent gases. But this is not really an accurate depiction of what an increase or decrease would do to our climate, to the actual warming. What would happen to the warming is the following. If you increase methane, then yes, the warming increases. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. There's no question about that. However, if you keep your livestock and poultry herds and flocks constant, meaning you don't increase the numbers, if you keep those emissions constant, then that has no impact on warming. No impact on warming. In fact, you will have a slight cooling effect. If you decrease methane strongly, let's say by 35% over 30 years, you have a strong cooling effect. Now, how cool is that? No pun intended. What that means is that if we manage to reduce methane, then that reduction of methane is equal to pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And that is effectively a cooling impact. So our livestock and poultry herds and flocks have the ability to cool the climate and counteract some of that warming impact from fossil fuels. Now that puts us at a totally different narrative. One away from being a problem to being a potential solution. Now you will ask, is it possible to reduce something like methane by 35%? Well, here in California, we actually have a new law. Surprise, surprise. A law on methane that mandates a 40% reduction. That's 40% reduction of methane to be achieved 10 years from now by the year 2030. At first, our farmers were up in arms, wondering how in the world can we make that work? But then the legislature had a wise moment. They decided that instead of the traditional rules and regulation and fine approach, they would go the incentive approach. And so what they did was they said, if you find a way to reduce methane, we will incentivize that financially. They partnered with our livestock and poultry industry and put in $500 million to help farmers put in technologies to reduce methane. That happened 2.5 years ago. And let's see what the results have been. The results have been that since 2015, California dairies alone have reduced greenhouse gases by 2.2 million metric tons. We have already in California reduced methane by 25%. I told you we have a 40% reduction goal. We are over halfway there. We're over halfway there. 25% reduction of methane. In other words, the dairy sector here alone, I'm not even talking about poultry and all the others, just the dairy sector. And I give you that example so that you have an idea of what's also possible in your industry. The dairy sector alone has reduced its methane by 25%, largely through the use of anaerobic digesters, by the way. Anaerobic digesters, which also are a means of producing biogas from poultry operations, can be used throughout the livestock and poultry industries to not just cap and capture methane from escaping from the manure, but you can take that biogas, that methane, half of the biogas is methane, you can take that biogas and convert it into renewable natural gas, RNG. And renewable natural gas is a fuel that you can use to run entire vehicle fleets of it. Meaning you can take biogas from, let's say, a dairy or a poultry operation, convert it into RNG, renewable natural gas, which is a fuel, and then run entire vehicle fleets of that RNG. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the new gold rush in California. It is very highly incentivized and credited if you convert biogas into RNG. Low carbon fuel standards and RIN credits are given, and both of them are highly lucrative. So our farmers are incentivized to do what's right, to reduce emissions, and produce utilities such as fuels. And it's working very well. So here at Davis, we do a lot of research on quantifying emissions from livestock poultry operations. We are quantifying reductions and so forth. That's ongoing research. I will now move the discussion into why do we care about warming or cooling? Why does it matter? And what is the whole talk about the 2050 challenge? This slide here is one of my favorite slides. It shows on the x-axis the years 1750 to 2050, hence the name 2050 challenge. And on the z-axis here, to the right, you see the number of, or the population, human population on our planet. So I just turned 50. When I was a little boy, we were right here at 3 billion people. Today, we are at 7.6. And by the time I'm an old man, we'll be at 9.5 billion people in the world. 9.5 billion people. In other words, throughout your lifetime and mine, the human population on our planet will have tripled. Tripled. We'll have 3 times more people on this planet, but we'll not have 3 times more natural resources to feed these people. And this is a really important concept so many don't understand. They think, many people in society think, what we need to do is go back to the 1950s, have small farms with 50 chickens, with 20 pigs, with 3 or 4 cows. They say everything that's intensive is factory farming, is deplorable, inhumane, polluting, and so on. You hear the news like I hear them. The question is it time yet? Is it time yet to change the narrative here as well? And in my opinion, it is high time. What you see on this slide is also not just a drastic increase, but you see 2 colors. You see this orange, and that's human population development in the developed countries. You can see that we are plateauing in the developed countries, so Europe and Americas and so on. But in the emerging and developing countries, human population is skyrocketing. And the reason for this is particularly increasing life expectancies. People all over the world get older, when in the past, life expectancy was maybe 60 in many developing countries. It's now also much higher, 70, 80. And cumulatively, that means more mouths to feed. This is one of my favorite slides as well. It shows the world from space and a circle over South and Southeast Asia. And that circle contains more people in it than the rest of the world combined. So if you want to know what the hotspot is globally for food security, it's certainly Asia, parts of Asia, and as the next slide shows, also Africa. While Asia will increase human population by 41%, and that's in particular India, Bangladesh, and those countries, not so much China, Africa is increasing by almost half, 50% population increase by the year 2050. South America will increase by 7, North America by 4, Europe will slightly shrink. Clearly, the food security issues of the future will occur in Asian and African countries. This here is a depiction of meat consumption patterns from 1995 until predicted 2025. What you see here are different regions. You see that in the Middle East and in North Africa, meat consumption is going up pretty high. You see here Southeast Asia in dotted lines. You see that that's also going, quite high. You see South America in green going up. You see Sub-Saharan Africa kind of plateauing, and that has a lot to do with people not having high disposable incomes that they can spend on animal source foods. And then you see that the developed countries are really plateauing by and large. There might be a small uptick, but by and large, they are plateauing. So you see that developing countries, emerging countries are increasing their meat consumption, and that has everything to do with people having higher disposable incomes. As soon as people have more disposable income, the first thing they do is increase, for example, animal source foods in the form of eggs or chicken meat or meat in general, or dairy products. So that's a very clear picture. So while we have an increasing human population, while we have areas of food insecurity, while we have an increasing demand of animal source foods, we also are limited. You see here global livestock distribution. By far, India, China, they are where the music plays with respect to total livestock and poultry numbers. China alone has half of the world's pigs. That's pre-African swine fever. Half of the world's pigs were produced in China. Think about that. Enormous concentrations. And that's met with something that concerns me, namely a real lack of cropland throughout the world. We don't really have a whole lot of cropland. And that land is not really expendable by much. I mean, we can maybe get another 5 or 10% of cropland globally, but we also have a lot of existing cropland degrading. And so we have a tripling of human population throughout our lifetimes, but we are limited with respect of farmable land, of usable land to produce food. By the way, many people say, well, we use 70% or so of all agricultural land for livestock and poultry, and that's too much. We should grow crops there instead. That is not true, because what happens in the majority of that 70% of agricultural land is that these lands are marginal in value. They're either not fertile enough or don't have enough water to grow crops. And so a lot of the land that's used for livestock and poultry, particularly, most of that land is marginal. And most of that land, by the way, is used by ruminant livestock. So while you in the poultry industry, while you don't have the same pressure around methane, of course, non-from enteric methane, but overall the methane pressures are lower, the pressures you have are more around the fact that what you feed to your chickens is human edible crops. So more radical extremists will say, well, we shouldn't really produce poultry because what we feed poultry could be eaten by people directly. That's the criticism that you get, which of course is kind of a lame argument because people seek to eat animal source foods, and particularly eggs and poultry meat and so forth, for taste, for cultural, for religious, for other reasons, or just preference reasons. So and that's not going down, that's going up. And there's really little doubt in my mind. This is a depiction, a cow example, but it applies just as well to you. It shows the relationship between productivity, in the case here of a cow. This is fat and protein corrected milk on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, it's the carbon footprint. Each dot here depicts one country in the world and its milk production. And what you see here is that there are many, many countries that produce very little milk per cow per year. So this is like 1,000 pounds of the, 500 kilograms of milk per cow per year. That's nothing. And look how many countries fall into that category. The United States is someplace here off the scale. We're producing about over 10 tons, over 10,000 kilograms of milk per cow per year. And many developing countries produce 10 to 20 times less milk per cow per year. The same is true for beef. The same is true for poultry. The same is true for all animal source foods. We have many countries where productivity is just dismal. And because of that, we have high environmental footprints of livestock and poultry in these countries. So what has gotten us to a place where we're producing now 23,000 pounds of milk, for example, per cow per year. And again, the same is true for poultry and other species here. So we have done 4 major things. We have improved reproduction, improved the health of our animals by vaccination and or treatment. We've improved the genetics, and we have learned to feed more energy-dense diets. The combination of these 4 has allowed us to shrink the number of animals that we need to produce a given amount of product. And that has been drastic. This is another dairy example here. So if you compare 1944 versus 2007 environmental impacts, you find that in 2007, we only use 21% of the animals, 35% of the water, 10% of the land, and 37% of the carbon footprint is now reduced. So reductions of all environmental impacts can be seen on the dairy side. Here you see poultry efficiency in the case of broilers from 1925 until, and that's predicted 2045. You see the conversion, the feed conversion, being incredible. I mean, what a success story you have to tell. Conversion efficiency. You just have to make sure that when you tell the story, that you tell it in a way that people understand. And that might sound trivial, but it's not. People understand, for example, the connection between fuel efficiency of a car and emissions. They understand that. They understand that a car that you drive today is more fuel efficient than the car that your parents drove or your grandparents drove. All 3 cars might have gotten you from A to B, but today's car gets you there with much less gas. Much less gas means much fewer emissions. People get it, but they don't get feed efficiency, okay? You have to explain to them what that means for animals to gain more with relatively less feed. Look what happened to mortalities, and that's, of course, in the area of welfare. Mortalities have gone down drastically. The age of the animals has gone down drastically, and that has a direct impact on the environmental footprint, and so forth. You have a great story to tell. Tell it. You've all seen this here, I assume, 1957 versus 2001 chickens. Again, you have an incredible story to tell. Some people say, never before have we eaten more meat. Is that true? Let's take a look. On this slide, you see the years 1909 until 2015. So what you find here is that beef has not really moved. Okay, we are eating as much beef today in the United States as we did in 1909. Total red meat has gone down slightly by 3%, but total meat has gone up by 53%. Why? Because of you, because of chickens. We are eating 500% more chicken today than we ate in 1909. Your commodity is probably the most spectacular success story across the entire animal industry. Same is true for eggs, but here I just show chicken meat. Now we have all these different groups here who feel that they need to throw pot shots at us in animal agriculture. These groups are groups that I routinely deal with, among others. You should not include the UC Davis Clear Center here, but the others here are very concerned about animal agriculture and frequently report on how bad we are. In most cases, there's very little substance behind it, but they repeat and repeat and repeat claims, and after a while, things stick with the consumer. This here is PETA, and you can see even they are now jumping on the climate change thing and say meat, #1 cause of global warming. They are all tooting that horn. You have these activist groups run very effective campaigns. You might remember a few years ago, Proposition 2 here in California, where the Humane Society of the United States supported a proposition that outlawed the use of cages pretty much, and that was voted in favor, 65%, and now we're in a situation where you cannot have normal battery cages anymore. Animals have to be given more space. There's pretty large confusion as to how much space, whether that means everybody has to be free range, and so forth. So that's just activists being successful, really successful. Then we also see that there are people who want us all to become vegetarians and or vegans being very active. You might have heard about the dietary guideline outcome here from last week. The dietary guidelines in Canada, they are called something else, but they are pretty extreme. You see them here. This is the Canadian Food Guide. It says we should eat half of all food daily, vegetables and fruit. A quarter should be grains. And then these here are the proteins. You find this little wedge here, I think it's like 7 grams of poultry meat, and then no more than 1/4 egg a day. They allow you 1.5 eggs per week and say that's healthy and everything else is too much. I'm very concerned when I hear these kind of things, and I encourage you and the organizations to really chime in when dietary guidelines are formed, when these discussions come up, because falsehood is being repeated over and over and over again. And everybody knows that once you do that, once you repeat falsehood over and over and over again, some of it will stick, okay? And I think it's really important for you to pay attention to this. In addition to all of this, we have now some players on the market or in the marketplace, like this fine gentleman here. His name is Pat Brown, the inventor of the Impossible Burger. And they are saying that there's nothing more destructive to our earth than livestock and poultry. And so everybody now needs to go plant-based and use products like his to replace the original. They are tooting that horn hard. And they're getting some traction, particularly with the younger ones, the millennials and Generation Z. So then I oftentimes get asked, can we eat our way out of climate change? The media suggests we can. Can we eat our way out of climate change is the question. A study by Wines and Nicholas relatively recently found that if you were an omnivore and you were to decide to go vegan for 1 year, then going vegan would reduce your carbon footprint by 0.8 tons. 0.8 tons. Contrast that with a single flight from the United States to Europe, which has a carbon footprint of 1.6 tons. So going vegan for 1 year has half the footprint on climate as one transatlantic flight. A meatless Monday in the United States, done by all 320 million Americans, would reduce the carbon footprint of our nation by 0.3%. And everybody going vegan would reduce our carbon footprint by 2.6%. Now, there are some people that do, of course, go vegan. In fact, this here comes from the Vegan Society of the United States. And I find it very informative because what it shows is that 10% of people in the United States have tried to be vegan. 2%, less than 2%, are currently vegetarian and vegan. What they are saying with this statistics here is that 84% of all vegetarians and vegans abandon their diet after 1 year. They stay vegan, vegetarian for 1 year on average, and then they abandon it. In other words, for every one active vegan in the United States, there are 5 former vegans. Now, is that a successful diet, one that everybody should strive for? In my opinion, it's not. Last not least, if you really want to know what the biggest environmental challenge of our food supply chain is, of our entire food system is, not just in the US, but globally, it's depicted on this one here. This one shows the food that's wasted by the average family in the United States per year. 40%, 40, of all food produced in the United States, in Europe, even in developing countries, is wasted and goes to landfills. That, ladies and gentlemen, is really something that we need to change, that's unacceptable, and that we can all do better with. So with that, I close, and I thank you so much for your attention. I wish I could have seen you in person, but I did my best. So here's my webpage for the CLEAR Center, and I'm now happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this wonderful and elegant presentation. We have a few questions here, but please keep in mind, if we run out of time, we have only 9 minutes left, you have the opportunity, your answer will be provided in reporting. We have your email, and Frank will answer that. The first question is from Kyla Price, Alltech. And she said, as there is more demand for poultry meat and egg, we will have to increase our flock size. How can we increase the flock size while combating the methane impact and or still have a neutral carbon recycling potential?
So if you want to increase flock sizes, then you need to concurrently, in my opinion, do something about the main emission source, which is the manure. And a technology like an anaerobic digester can do that. There are also other technologies that can reduce greenhouse gases. So if you increase flock size, then you need to counteract that with some technology that deals with either your manure on the backside or the feed on the front side, because both areas are areas where you can reduce emissions, and that's what would counterbalance the increasing flocks.
The next question is from Jacqueline Jacob from University of Kentucky. What size of the poultry farm manure produced that would be required to make an anaerobic digester economical for a poultry farm?
Yeah, good question. There's no simple answer to that. In fact, if you go to a country like India, you will find hundreds of thousands of digesters, small-sized digesters, okay? It does not need to be a multi-million-dollar vast mixed digester. Digesters work on almost every level. So there are small ones that I've seen for small flocks, for really small farms. And then there are some that can easily digest 30 tons a day. So there is really hardly any limitation one way or the other.
Thank you. Next question is from Shamin Akhtar from Bangladesh. What is your suggestion for a country like Bangladesh to sustain the 2050 challenge with poultry production?
The biggest challenge a country like Bangladesh has is that your human population increase is drastic, just like it is in India. And I think this is really where your biggest challenge lies, because you will have issues with the nutrients, getting nutrients into your livestock, getting enough nutrients for your livestock, and then what to do with what comes out with the excreta. So there is really no easy answer. I think Bangladesh is one of the most difficult countries in the world with respect to producing enough animal source foods on the one hand, but also then dealing with the environmental consequences. No easy answer. If you contact me via email, then we can have an in-depth discussion about this, because it's multifaceted, but it is a major challenge.
Thank you, Frank. We have another question from Carlos Soto from the United Animal Health. He said, what percentage of feed is excreted by each broiler? Can we reduce this waste?
More important than what percentage of feed is excreted, what percentage of nutrients are excreted. And here in particular, phosphorus, there are several nutrients where poultry is not really efficient and where they excrete a lot. And can it be increased? Can it be changed? The answer is yes. And we can deal with various pollutants that are associated with poultry manure by using manure additives or certain technologies around nitrogen, around phosphorus, around several of the things that that come out of your chickens and that can become environmental liabilities. I think one of the greatest challenges you have in the poultry area is nuisances, because the manure is quite rich in odors, and fly issues are prevalent, and dust issues are prevalent. That is probably one of the greatest challenges I see on the poultry side, namely that there are considerable nuisances associated with it.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Christopher Manches from the University of New England. He said, research on quality of livestock based on consumer demands contribute to wastage of food. What can be done by researchers to convince consumers who buy foods based on appearance?
I think we all do this. Okay, when we go to the supermarket and we buy produce, what do? I mean, we look at firmness and how good it looks and so on, and we leave the stuff behind that doesn't look perfect. This is a psychological thing. I don't think it has. I think there's a lot of space for us researchers in addressing it. I think we need to get this clear to the consumers that the amount of food we throw away because it doesn't look perfect is staggering. It is unbelievable. And the consumer is not aware of that. When I tell consumer groups that on average we are throwing away 40% of all food, they just cannot believe it. They cannot believe it, but we all do it. That's not just you and me, that's the entire food supply chain. These are food losses and food waste both. So what happens on the farm and what happens beyond the farm. And it's really amazing how wasteful we are, not just here in the United States or in Europe, but globally. In developing countries, food losses occur more at the farm level because they can't harvest on time, transport, preserve, and so on. So it's more of a farm issue there. It's more of a consumer issue here in the developed world.
Thank you, Frank. We have, I think, a question here from genetic standpoint from Sasha Vanderklein from Hendrix Genetics. What do you think should be the focus now, or can be the biggest win in the output, manure, the input, feed, or the black box, breeding for more efficient animals?
There is no this or that. There is this and that. Okay, that's all I can tell you. There are significant improvements on the feed, on the manure, and also on the genetic side. I mean, people said 50 years ago we can no longer improve the genetics of chickens. Of course we can, and we did, drastically so. And I just showed you some examples. The same is true for manure. In the past, we had kind of a pass on manure in many cases. That will go away. We will have to deal with the most important pollutants effectively. There are now technologies that can address just about anything. We have to see how can we do this in a cost-effective way, because at the end of the day, technologies are there for almost everything. The question is, who pays for it? Who pays for these extra costs? Will this be acceptable for society to pay more for whatever product they consume, if it's greener, so to say? And yeah, well, whether that happens is really a societal decision. It's a public policy decision, one that we should also push for.
We have 18 seconds maybe for one last question. Here from Naila Ben Sesi, University of Guelph, Canada. Given the spread of animal welfare issues because of genetic improvement, do you think we can go a step further in improving welfare while maintaining current productivity?
I think so. We should then focus more on bone strength and on issues that could be impeded welfare-wise. Yeah, I think it's possible, but we have to do some research in this field for sure.
Thank you so very much, Frank, for your elegant presentation. And I am really sorry that we ran out of time. It is 10 o'clock and there are some other symposium. We will address your question. I will communicate with Frank and we will address your question in provided reporting. Thank you very much, and please all stay healthy and safe.
Thank you.